Greetings, YouTube visitors. Welcome to Around the World News for April the 7th. This is being recorded a little bit late, but this is for yesterday, actually. So let me get right into this. This is post-Syrian attack under Trump. Yesterday was huge and ominous for so many reasons. Let's take a look at what happened and what it means, and what it likely means. For starters, Steve Bannon was removed from the National Security Council. This was followed by President Trump claiming that Syria, Assad, crossed so many lines and gassed their own people. We also saw major reversals in markets. Stocks turned down from huge gains and posted their largest reversal in 14 months. Gold and silver, which were down for most of the day, reversed to close unchanged to slightly up. Yesterday was preceded by 2 weeks of hardline North Korea talk. Russia and China announced forming an alliance where they move away from the dollar and begin to bring gold back into the monetary system. Well, that would be a change, wouldn't it? That'd be good. That's been the basis of all sound currencies. But when we get off the gold standard, then we have fiat currencies, which are created out of nothing, and we can manipulate the money supply through inflation, depression, recession, and this has been going on back and forth since 1913, when the Fed engineered the Great Depression. Now, they don't teach you that in the textbooks, okay, in high school or college, but this is the fact. We also heard on Obamacare and tax reform. Suddenly, both Obamacare repeal and Trump tax reform are dead. Yesterday was followed by today. Unless we forget, Mr. Trump and Mr. Z, am I pronouncing that right? XI? Never heard that name pronounced too often, so I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. Are meeting in what can only be called an emergency meeting. So why was yesterday so important? How do these dots connect? First, the ouster of Steve Bannon leaves Mr. Trump surrounded by Goldmanites and military generals. In other words, the deep state. This move can be seen as the war hawks cementing power. We should have seen this coming with all the hardline speeches against North Korea, but now confirmed by the move versus Syria. Syria is now, again, accused of gassing their own people. This doesn't make sense, as Russia has been aiding them for nearly the last year, gaining and solidifying their position versus ISIS. A good analysis can be found here. It's a RonPaulLibertyReport.com. RonPaulLibertyReport.com/flag-Ron-Paul-says-Syrian. Anyway, I don't want to keep going. It's rather long. You'll find it on Ron Paul's site. The news over the weekend by China and Russia regarding gold will certainly be followed by other countries. Ask yourselves this: what if the Saudis followed? And what it would mean for the petrodollar? Please remember the history of those Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi who tried to sell oil for anything other than dollars. What happened to them? They were murdered. I ought to tell you that we got some evil people behind the scenes in Washington that are calling the shots, okay? Well, God is calling the shots ultimately. He's sovereign, but what I'm saying is that these men think they're calling the shots, and to a large degree, the Lord allows them to get away with their evil. Saudi Arabia has already fallen to second place in their oil supply in China. Can they really not join the club? If they refuse, what would it mean for their currency? And at a time of drastically lowered revenue and grossly higher borrowings, it is as if they get on the China-Russia train immediately, or it leaves the station without them. It is apparent the United States and Mr. Trump are now setting sights on Syria and North Korea. With Syria, this goes directly against Mr. Putin and Russia, while any attack on North Korea would be taking on China. Does this make any sense at all? It does not. But unfortunately, it looks like exactly what the deep state has decided. Remember, we talked about the deep state being the global elite, the globalists like George Soros and the Rockefellers, Henry Kissinger, people like that, billionaires in other words, the Bushes, and others that aren't readily known. These are the people that gathered together at Bilderberger meetings, for example, which started in 1954, I believe, at a hotel. And these people get together and they formulate foreign policies, when to strike as far as war goes and attacks on various countries, when they're going to take down presidents, who they're going to put in replace of those presidents. Oh, you weren't taught this in high school or college, were you? You better start listening to this channel or other similar channels to start learning what's really going on in the world. Don't be naive. Satan, in my opinion, has been let loose. And this is why we see all this chaos taking place around the world right now. This is why the churches have gone apostate, because false gospels have entered in. The churches are inundated by tares rather than wheat. So on all fronts, with the family under attack through divorce, the churches, and Washington, D.C., the District of Criminals. What can we expect from our leaders, political leaders? Well, they're not even leaders. They're just following an evil cabal. Continuing. It does not make sense, but unfortunately looks like exactly what the deep state has decided. Please remember, over the last couple of years, I have theorized the United States would create some sort of false flag in order to tank markets or close them, and put the blame on collapse on something other than bad policies bankrupting the nation. Yeah, it's the bad policies, the bad economic policies. Let me tell you some people you need to listen to. Because I'm not an expert on financial matters, but you need to listen to people like Peter Schiff, who I've met on several occasions. Very brilliant guy, as far as an understanding of the overall market. And you need to start listening to some of the conservative thinkers, conservative think tanks. You need to start listening to some of the people that aren't even around anymore. If you want to listen to some of the great theologians and preachers, you need to kind of go back a ways, because there aren't too many living anymore. You need to listen to some of the thinking of the late Dr. R.J. Rushdoony, which most of you have never even heard of. And why is that? Well, have you heard of Dr. Francis Schaeffer? I'm sure you've heard of him. Well, he wasn't any better thinker than Dr. Rushdoony. They were pretty similar, but Rushdoony, in my opinion, was superior in his understanding of theology, and was better well read. Now, Francis Schaeffer had a... I'm digressing for a second, obviously, but this is important. Francis Schaeffer had an ability to communicate with college students and the common man, whereas Dr. Rushdoony was more geared toward, he targeted mostly like college professors, statesmen, certain political leaders, I guess, and lawyers like John Whitehead. By the way, if you haven't heard of John Whitehead, you need to get familiar with him. This book, John W. Whitehead, The Second American Revolution. Very simple read, but very good. And then The Separation Illusion, I think he talks about the myth of the separation of church and state. Anyway, the Rutherford Institute, he started it back in the 80s, I believe. And he was good friends with the late Dr. R.J. Rushdoony. So key in on his information. He has an update, maybe a email newsletter or something of that sort that will keep you informed on legal matters and religious persecution against Christians. All right, continuing. Before finishing, I do want to mention we may have finally discovered how the Comex shorts have been clandestinely settling for delivery. James Turk uncovered the how shorts have been using EFPs, exchange of futures for physicals, to settle. You can find that on kingworldnews.com. This past expiration saw a drop in open interest of 45,000 contracts just before first notice day and without much damage to price. It turns out that something like 111 tons 2 weeks of global production of gold settlement was diverted. I encourage you to read this carefully, as a massive short squeeze may be about to happen. To wrap this up, Russia and China do not appear to want war. It appears the United States does. In all probability, war will be used to cover up bankruptcy, as closed markets and banks can be blamed on war. China and Russia have been obviously planning for several years to cut away from dollar settlement and now appear ready. In my opinion, it would behoove them to pull the plug on the US dollar swamp as soon as possible, and maybe the moment Mr. Z concludes his meeting. Nothing from here on should surprise you. Why now? Well, if the financial plug is pulled, it certainly makes it harder for the United States to invade or make war anywhere in the world. The problem is this: in today's nuclear world, whoever is losing has the last gasp ability to push buttons and throw one last haymaker. If this is the case, no preparations will help us. However, if cooler heads prevail and war is averted, then the reality of the bankrupt United States will come front and center. Either way, it looks to me like some sort of market closing event is very near at hand. Just know this: the moment the markets and banks close is the moment the reset occurs. You may not realize it at the time, but since you will be locked out and stuck with what you have, your assets and standard of living will be far different when markets begin to reopen. You must be in place and in position before this happens, because unless you are an insider, you will have zero notice on timing. You very well may wake up and not even have your cup of coffee before you know game is over upon us, which is then too late. Standing watch. That's from Bill Holter. The Holter-Sinclair collaboration from JS Mindset. All right. More on the Syrian government. Syrian government has categorically denied launching chemical weapons against civilians or terrorists. Russia has reaffirmed that the Syrian military is innocent of the charges brought by the West with a military source, telling Al Masdar News that the army has not and does not use them, not in the past and not in the future, because it does not have them in the first place. Exactly. Don't be naive and believe the mainstream news media. That's why you're watching this channel right now, because it's alternative news. It's news that covers events from around the world that you need to be familiar with. And you need to educate your fellow Christians and your family members, because most of them are in the dark. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, the incident was not a chemical weapon attack, but the result of an SAA airstrike against a terrorist weapons depot that was also being used for the production of chemical weapons. Major General Igor Konashenkov, the Defense Ministry spokesman, stated that the facility was being used to produce these chemical weapons for shipment to terrorist forces inside Iraq. The warehouse was bombed, according to Konashenkov, the warehouse that was bombed was being used to both produce and store shells that contained toxic gas, which were then shipped to Iraq and used there. He pointed out that both the Iraqi government and a number of international organizations have confirmed the use of these types of weapons by terrorists operating in Iraq. Konashenkov added that the terrorists used the same type of weapons in Aleppo, where Russian military experts took samples in 2016. The Russian Defense Ministry claims to have confirmed this information as being fully objective and verified. The ministry also claimed that the victims of Khan Shaykhun exhibited identical symptoms to those shown by victims in the Aleppo attacks. According to Russian airspace monitoring systems, yesterday between 11:30 and 12:30 local time, the Syrian aviation carried out an airstrike on the eastern outskirts of Khan Shaykhun, targeting a major ammunition storage facility of terrorists and a cluster of military hardware. The territory of the storage facility housed workshops to produce projectiles stuffed with toxic agents. Major General Igor Konezhkov said, "From this major arsenal, chemical-laden weapons were delivered by militants to Iraq. Their use by terrorists was confirmed on numerous occasions by international organizations and official authorities of the country," he said. Video footage from social networks show that those affected in Khan Shaykhun demonstrate the same symptoms of poisoning as the victims of the Aleppo attack had last fall, he added. "We assure that this information is completely unbiased and true." Shan is terrorist-held territory, and it is held by force. Naturally, the Syrian people in Khan Shaykhun are no more interested in being ruled by Neanderthal freaks as any other town in the country, and thus terrorists must be present to maintain order and prevent Syrians from expressing civilized behavior. Second, terrorists in Syria have for years had the ability to manufacture, produce, and use chemical weapons. Back in December of 2012, after the death squads managed to capture a chlorine factory in Syria, the Syrian government actually issued a warning that the death squads might attempt to use chemical weapons of this nature in their battle to overthrow and oppress the government and people of Syria respectively. Yeah, folks, they don't want Assad in power. Who does this benefit? It benefits... Who does it benefit? It benefits Israel, for one thing. And those words came directly, this isn't original with me, but it makes sense. This came directly from Radio Talk host Michael Savage. A very smart Jew with Christian leanings, okay? The Syrian Foreign Ministry stated that terrorist groups may resort to using chemical weapons against the Syrian people after having gained control of a toxic chlorine facility. Likewise, the chemical weapon attacks in Ghouta, G-O-U-T-A, Ghouta, were initially blamed on Assad and the Syrian government, but later found to be the work of the Western-backed terrorists, who had gone so far as to capture civilians from Latakia and use them as human stage props for video footage and propaganda purposes. That means the United States. Certain people within the United States are behind this attack in Syria. And, of course, Trump is buying it, and that's why he launched the attack. But surely, Trump isn't that naive, or is he? Considering the hysteria over chemical weapons and the constant attempts by Western governments to use them as an excuse to invade Syria, why on earth would the Syrian government use them even if the government did indeed retain the weapons? Such an act would be absolutely foolish in terms of world public opinion and in terms of the opinion of the United Nations. On top of that, Khan Shaykhun is not even militarily significant. So why would the Syrian government choose to use chemical weapons at this location and not somewhere more important? It is unlikely that such an attack was carried out deliberately by the Syrian armed forces, says Blankenship. The Syrian Arab army is decisively winning the war at this point in the conflict on essentially every front. A resort to weapons of mass destruction would be not only militarily irrational, considering Khan Shaykhun is nowhere near the front line, but would be politically absurd considering the new U.S. administration statement last week that the Assad government would no longer be the primary target in Syria. It's important to be skeptical of the idea that a government at war that relies on broad cross-sectional support from its own people to maintain its sovereignty is willing to attack its own civilians. One of the first red flags regarding the official story of this incident is the fact that the sole source of the reports come from the opposition, that is, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, white helmets, and terrorists themselves. The SOHR, of course, is notorious pro-terrorist organization run by one man out of England and funded by a nameless European Union country. SOHR is, at best, only connected to Syria through its connections to terrorists and Western intelligence